All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second session of the Fair Housing and Housing Development series. This training is being recorded, so if anyone needs to step away, we are recording it. So yeah, I'm going to get started here. So my name is Brianna Miranda. I'm one of now two education and outreach coordinators here at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. We're so happy that you're able to join us for our second session, Fair Housing and Housing Development Series, Nuts and Bolts of Law. Today, I'm joined again by Alan Lazo, our lead presenter during this series, and I'm excited to welcome Tyler Oxt of MSU Extension. Alan is the former executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. He has been a longtime community advocate for civil rights and is currently serving on Oregon's Land Conservation and Development Committee. He's also working with Oregon's Housing Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. Alan kicked off the series last month and will be our anchor for our following two sessions. Tyler is a government and community vitality educator for Southwest Michigan with the Michigan State University Extension and Michigan Sea Grant, focusing on land use, zoning, planning, and community development. Previously, he spent time working on increasing civic and democratic participation in a variety of K-12 post-secondary settings, including a year serving as an AmeriCorps Vista with the Eastern Upper Peninsula Intermediate School District and working with 4-H. Tyler is someone we've wanted to work with for some time now, and we're so glad to have him with us. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I have a few logistics and reminders to share. This is a webinar, so we cannot see or hear you. Please use the chat to request any assistance on this. Please use the Q&A to submit any questions. Questions in the chat may not be able to get answered. We will be taking clarifying questions during the presentation, but we'll have time at the end to address additional questions and to have some conversation with our two speakers, so please submit them. In addition, please fill out our evaluation that will appear in your browser. We will also provide a link at the end. Certificates will be an option for those of you who complete it. Please fill out that information to the fullest so we can get those certificates to you, and please allow a few weeks for us to get those out. This presentation is being recorded and the link will be sent out after the training. You can also visit our new Fair Housing and Housing Development page, which will be posted in the chat. That will have a link to the recording, the slides, and any other resources that are relevant. Well, that is all it for housekeeping. So now please welcome Alan and Tyler. Alan, you can present first.
Great. Thank you so much, Bree. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. So as Bree said, if folks, I just wanted to go back a little bit to the first session and note that, in this series, we're kind of building up on different parts of the work that we're doing around housing development and creating inclusive and equitable communities. In that first session, we really talked about this historical events that really create the why of why we need to create opportunities to redress those inequities, and particularly the racial inequities that we see in communities today and in housing. In this session, as Bree said, we're going to talk specifically about tools, or the nuts and bolts of the laws and other tools that are available to us to help redress some of those inequities. And then in the next two sessions, in July and August, we'll move on to talk about how communities might implement these tools and which of those tools might fit best for them. For folks that were here for session one, you might remember that I am here in my home office in Portland, Oregon, and I've never been to where many of you are out there in Michigan or West Michigan, and so it was very helpful for me to create a map to see kind of where things were. And really, we also used that map in the first session to talk about this timeline that we have that illustrates for us how it is we got to where we are today as a country, as a community, and really these processes that took place to get us where we are today. This historical set of racial discrimination in housing that led to the inequities that we see in things like the disparities in home ownership in still racially and economically segregated communities. And we can also use that map analogy and expand that to really look at not only where we are today, but where we want to be. And as we've talked about in this series, we really are looking at how can we create more equitable, more inclusive communities through the housing development work that we do. And, oops, sorry here. And really, again, it also sets up these markers along that pathway that can help us look at the tools that we can use to get to that end that we're looking for. When Tyler comes on, he'll talk a little bit about the Michigan statewide housing plan and what are the tools that are available there, and the local tools and things like the housing needs assessment that communities can use to help direct where they're headed in their housing development. I think one of the things that's really important about something like a statewide housing plan is that it really sets out the intentions that folks have in the kinds of communities that they want to create and where they're headed in housing development. And plans like this, it's really also nice to note that it includes several aspects that intersect with or related to work that we do in the fair housing community. So Tyler will discuss some of those local and Michigan related items for you all there. And for those of us in the fair housing movement, one of the critical moments along that pathway has been the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which was intended to redress the direct racial discrimination in housing that was taking place in the early part and the mid part of the 20th century. Dr. King was an instrumental part of moving that open housing or fair housing movement forward. And we also recognize that some of the folks that are with us today may have a grounding in the work that's being done in fair housing, but we'll cover some of the basics of this just to be sure that we all have a shared understanding of this work. So we're going to be covering in a fairly broad way a range of elements related to the Fair Housing Act and fair housing laws, and we'll try to focus on the intersections again with our main topic of housing development and how we create inclusive communities with the Fair Housing Act as one of those tools. So what is fair housing? So fair housing is it's a civil rights law that makes it illegal to discriminate in housing based on protected classes or characteristics for an individual. The Federal Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 as part of a suite of other major civil rights legislation like the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. And again, those civil rights laws are based on protected classes or protected characteristics. So it makes it illegal to discriminate based on these federal protected classes. The first four in the original Federal Fair Housing Act were race, color, religion, and national origin. Sex or gender was added in 1974. So again, when you think about those first four federally protected classes, you recognize that they were implemented in response to what was happening in this country around racial discrimination in housing and the protections that were needed. And also you see again that gender or sex was added in 1974 as part of the women's rights movement that was happening at that time. And then the final two, familial status and disability, were added in 1988. Again, in response to what was happening in the marketplace with regard to, for instance, families with children. In Oregon, like 70% of the rentals at that time, prior to the passage of familial status as protected class, said no children allowed, right? So it was legal prior to those protections to actually not allow children in some rentals. And similarly with disability, this was the time around the passage of the Americans with Disabilities and the individual, the independent living movement for persons living with disabilities. In addition to the federal protected classes, there can be state or local protected classes also. So the state of Michigan adds age and marital status as protected classes, and places like Grand Rapids add height, weight, sexual orientation, and gender identity as protected classes. Now, fair housing laws and regulations cover a wide breadth of transactions related to housing, really everything related to housing transactions, whether it's rental, leasing, sale, lending, and housing, are covered by the Fair Housing Act and fair housing laws. And they prohibit a very wide range of actions that are illegal under the Fair Housing Act. This is the HUD website here. I'll just kind of go through it. You won't be able to read all these, but I'll give you a link to that. really what we see mostly are things like a refusal to rent or sell based on somebody's protected characteristics, or make housing that's unavailable to somebody based on their protected characteristics. It's illegal under the Fair Housing Act to have different terms or conditions based on someone's protected characteristics, or to deny housing based on those characteristics, or deny that housing is available based on those characteristics, right? Telling somebody that, oh, an apartment's already been rented because you don't want to rent to them because they have kids. There's also prohibitions against advertising or notices that have preferences or limitations based on protected characteristics. You also can't offer different criteria for applications based on protected characteristics. So there's a pretty wide range of activities or actions that are illegal or prohibited under fair housing laws. Now, I should also remind us, though, that it's not that you can't that what makes something illegal under civil rights laws, things like the Fair Housing Act, is that the discrimination takes place because of someone's protected characteristics. So it has to be based on the protected characteristic of that person, and the action is related to that for it to be illegal under these acts. So again, HUD provides some really good resources, as well as the Fair Housing Center of Western Michigan on fair housing laws. The work that's done in the fair housing movement that we do is under the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Program at HUD. And they've got an overview of the act there, that long list of what might be prohibited. And again, some really good examples of what housing discrimination might look like in practice. So as I said, we really want to focus on where those intersections are between fair housing and housing development. In the work we do, we know that affordable housing development, particularly regulated affordable housing, has a strong intersection with fair housing, and particularly because we know that there's an overrepresentation in regulated affordable housing of members of protected classes that are most likely to experience discrimination in the marketplace. So with regulated affordable housing, what becomes really important is this sense of location, location, location. Where can we actually develop affordable housing that is as good access to opportunities like so many other private market developments? NIMBYism is a big issue in how that gets excluded. Other exclusionary practices that we talked about can also come into play. So that's a big intersection with fair housing. Where does regulated affordable housing get built? There are also intersections that are related to specific protected classes. An example might be for families with children. If an area has occupancy standards or maximum number of bedrooms that might be built in a community, or a definition for family that can live together, they might be restrictive in a way that has an undue limitation or an undue impact on families or families with children. We also know that for people living with disabilities, there can be some also very specific accessibility issues around how we develop housing, the types of housing that get developed, where it gets developed. So we have some strong intention around making sure that places are accessible, not only accessible, but also visitable, right? People living with disabilities may not be able to visit other places or have the opportunity to enjoy or use parts of our communities, as well as the adaptability. Some people living with disabilities might need to have caretakers or people coming to assist them. So we need to make sure that those opportunities exist in our communities for people living with disabilities. Another issue that can be related to people living with disabilities is the location of group homes in communities. And this might be for people that are living with physical or unseen disabilities, as well as folks who might be in recovery. And we also, again, often see that NIMBYism that can be a real factor in where those group homes get located, and really need to pay attention to what is being said about the location of those types of facilities that serve members of protected classes. On the jurisdictional side, we also know that there are some real intersections with the work that gets done around things like land use planning and zoning. Um, again, it might be an intersection with fair housing when we have laws or other regulations that restrict or prohibit certain types of uses that might limit housing choice for certain members of protected classes. And again, those might not be outright regulations or restrictions, but it might be things like requiring projects to undergo additional steps for approval or additional hearings or meetings, for those types of housing projects, or it might have extra screening or setbacks or other modifications that might be specific to housing that serves specific members of protected classes. So again, we need to be careful about what the kinds of uh, requirements that we're putting in place around planning and zoning and how that intersects with members of protected classes. So for instance, if are we requiring certain security measures or other types of physical characteristics based on who might live in a particular type of housing? Could be issues that intersect with fair housing. The other pieces around the provision of public services and infrastructure by jurisdictions. There was a fair housing case out of Zanesville, Ohio, and there was an $11 million award made in 2008 against the city of Zanesville for the way that it provided water service to a Black community. The water service had run up to within about a mile of the Black community in Zanesville, Ohio, and then stopped. And that Black community was denied water service for 50 years there. And so again, they were found liable for this based on not equitably providing public infrastructure services. And this had been going on again since the mid part of the 20th century, but the evidence that uncovered it didn't come to be until they were able to show that inequity through GIS mapping, actually. So that's why that case didn't move forward until 2008. There's also could be intersections with the way that code enforcement might happen in a jurisdiction. When we think about parking or other types of violations, what can be in setbacks or in easements. We had a case out here in Oregon where a family had continued to get code violations for parking in an easement when they needed to park in the easement so that they could transport their son who was living with a disability. And so we're going to talk a little bit later about reasonable accommodation requests and how that works for persons living with disabilities. So we need to be careful again that these laws apply to not only housing providers, but jurisdictions and the full breadth of what a jurisdiction offers, not just the housing department. So if those are the intersections, what kinds of tools might we be able to engage to help us overcome or assert those rights? And we recognize again that these fair housing concepts and laws can really help us promote inclusive housing development by guiding jurisdictions and developers in the way they develop, but also allowing developers and residents both to use these tools to assert their rights to, again, help us reach that goal around equitable housing development. We see some strategies, for instance, that can help directly redress racial discrimination. Racial preferences are a very, very, very fine needle to thread, frankly. It's not an easy one under fair housing laws, frankly, because you can't use race as a preference itself. We actually have a preference policy in Portland in one area of town that is based on the displacement of Black community members in one area. And so it's sort of a right to return for community members that have been displaced. I've seen a preference policy in Seattle that was very similar. It was based on community members that had been displaced from a certain area and were able to come back because it did not increase the segregation in that part of the community. So you really got to work with an attorney or somebody who's very familiar with fair housing laws and HUD law regulations to understand whether or not you might be able to implement something like racial preferences. There are proxies that we use to help us redress racial discrimination. That's the best thing that we have right now. Some of that might be able to be developing local partnerships with culturally specific organizations. We do that in Portland. We work very closely with culturally specific organizations that work in housing development. And also there's a HUD affirmative marketing that's required of housing projects to have an affirmative marketing plan. And you could use that again to reach culturally specific organizations serving those communities that have been most often left out of or locked out of certain areas in our communities, areas of opportunity in particular. Then, as I talked about, we'll talk about the reasonable accommodation requests for people living with disabilities and how that might be used as a tool to help us move forward in more equitable communities, as well as the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing and disparate impact. So reasonable accommodations, a reasonable accommodation request is a request to change or provide an exception or adjustment to a rule or policy that would allow a person living with a disability to have the equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling, both public and including not only their private living arrangements, but public and common use spaces also. You know, when we know that when that reasonable accommodation request is made, it's intended to eliminate barriers, again, that prevent people living with disabilities from fully participating in housing opportunities that might exist. So it might be, again, you know, a request to park in an easement to transport somebody living with a disability. Very often what we see in rental situations, a reasonable accommodation request is a request for a parking spot near their unit because they may have an ambulatory issue that doesn't allow someone to walk as far. That's pretty common in rental, or accommodations for service animals or for animals like to help with certain disabilities. So with reasonable accommodations, again, we want to recognize that it's not limited only to folks who are providing housing, whether that's individuals or management companies or HOAs. It also applies at the bottom there to state and local governments, including in the context of exclusionary zoning or other land use decisions. So state and local governments cannot ignore reasonable accommodation requests that are related to what their policies and practices. So the reasonable accommodation request needs to be an iterative process that allows the person with a disability to make the request and then the other party to enter into a dialogue with that person living with a disability to understand how best to accommodate their needs. So I know that we've been talking with our colleagues there at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. You know, they had an instance where a family that had a person with them living with a disability had emailed the city about a reasonable accommodation request, and the city person that responded to them said that they don't grant reasonable accommodations. That's not the way the reasonable accommodation process works. That you need to enter into that dialogue, understand what the need is, and work to help accommodate that when it's possible. That family had recently requested of their homeowner association to take out some steps in their home, and you know, it was a design code enforcement type of issue, and had been denied by the homeowner association. So they went to the city, and the city said, no, we don't grant reasonable accommodation requests. Again, they are you know, that might be a measure that would exclude somebody from the opportunity to live in that community. And again, and they actually did decide to build somewhere else. And they actually made another reasonable accommodation request in the other community they decided to build in to have a design standard that lowered the level of the windows so that somebody who was using a wheelchair could see out the windows. So lots of different instances for the use of reasonable accommodation requests. In Oregon, we had a reasonable accommodation request that went to a homeowners association for them to be able to park a motorhome at their home. You know, lots of homeowners associations don't allow that. But they needed the motorhome to transport their daughter, who had some severe disabilities, to the hospital when needed. And it was a very extreme case, but the homeowners association said, no, you know, there's no exceptions. And so that became a pretty big case. So again, we can use those to help developers, you know, work with cities to fit the needs of people living with disabilities, and they really need to enter into that process. I think lots of housing providers are pretty familiar with the process, Jurisdictions may not be so much, and so something to certainly be aware of. And folks can certainly look at it as a tool to help create more inclusive communities for people living with disabilities. I think the other one, and again, there's some good resources at HUD for the reasonable accommodations. I think the other one I'll touch on briefly, and I touched on it in session one a little bit, was this concept that is built into the original Fair Housing Act, affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this related standard called disparate impact, that's a legal doctrine that really underlies much of the Fair Housing Act and allows plaintiffs to not need to prove that a policy was designed intentionally to discriminate, right? That's actually illegal under the Fair Housing Act and was made such in 1968. But instead you can show that it might have a discriminatory effect or impact against members of certain protected classes. So it can be a neutral policy that has that discriminatory effect as it's implemented. So an example of a disparate impact case was in 1981, when the local branch of the NAACP sued the town of Huntington, New York, over its refusal to allow multifamily housing to be built in a section of town that was 98% white and zoned for single-family homes. The NAACP won this case, proving that the defendant not only implemented a policy with a racially discriminatory effect that would have significantly perpetuated segregation, but also that the alleged reasons for doing so, traffic, parking, fire problems, and inadequate play areas, were, quote, weak justifications. So again, those are the kinds of defenses we often hear, or at least comments that come forward in these cases. So again, there's that disparate impact standard that exists there. It can be a high bar to cross sometimes, but it's underlies much of the way fair housing work is built. On the affirmatively furthering side, probably the most famous AFFH case was brought against Westchester County, New York, a very exclusive community outside of New York City. They were found in 2009, a judgment of $62.5 million was issued against Westchester County that required them to appropriate and spend nearly $52 million in county funds to develop at least 750 affordable housing units in Westchester County neighborhoods that had very small African or Latino populations. Again, they had taken $52 million in HUD money and affirmed that they were affirmatively furthering fair housing and meeting their AFFH obligations when in fact they weren't. And that's been a very long running case. And again, really points out that tool, while not widely implemented, is possible to help us really implement getting towards inclusive communities. We know that since 2015, when regulations have started to be promulgated around affirmatively furthering, it's been unclear what the obligations are for jurisdictions. But what we do know is that this concept around affirmatively furthering, around creating inclusive communities, has been a part of the Act since 1968 and can really help us further conversations about what we want our communities to look like. Out here in Oregon, so again, that's affirmatively furthering. Out here, we recognize that the work that can be done around affirmatively furthering is really an important aspect to how we plan our communities. And it's not just related, again, to specific housing, but how we develop our communities overall and the access particularly to community resources and to opportunity in communities. We've been fortunate in Oregon here to have leadership, and particularly our governor, very committed to the work around affirmatively furthering. When the governor took office in January, this is one of the first executive orders she issued around really increasing housing production in our state. And you'll see here under number C, producing housing not only more, but spatially in a way that is equitable and affirmatively furthers fair housing. And so some of the work that we've been doing out here, and we'll talk more about this in sessions 3 and 4, is really integrating affirmatively furthering fair housing into our housing planning system. And I'll leave this slide up here and just let it highlight. We have new rules in the state as communities are doing housing planning to integrate the AFFH concepts into the work they're doing, into the land use planning they're doing in housing in their communities. So it's an exciting time. Happy to talk more about what that's looked like out here in the process. It's a process that's happening as we speak. We're writing new rules right now that will hopefully be passed by the end of the year and be implemented in the next year or so. So with that, I will pass it kind of as we move towards the local pieces on to Tyler to talk about what's happening in Michigan and some of the ways moving forward there.
Of course, thank you, Alan. And I lied, I can't steal the share from you. So it looks like you're gonna have to hold down here real quick. Thank you. All right, well, hello, everybody. Like Bree said at the top, my name is Tyler Augst. I'm a government community vitality educator with MSU Extension and Michigan Sea Grant. And a lot of my work for Extension and Sea Grant focuses around land use, so planning and zoning, educating elected and appointed officials around their roles within that, but also broader issues around good governance, community development, coastal development here in the Great Lakes state. And over the past few years, really getting into these housing education pieces as we work with communities to help them understand what tools they have available. So here, as we work through my section on the slides, Alan had a very fancy roadmap. I just have an outline, but it's gonna map out where we're going. We're going to start talking a little bit about what the state here is in Michigan currently, both going over that state housing plan and a recently updated state housing needs assessment that came out. And then we're going to move into talking through just a brief recap of some of what the first session talked on, of that zoning as a tool for exclusion and what that's looked like. And then ending with some ideas on how to really start planning and zoning for both homes and equities. So the idea here is we're going to take things a little closer to home, looking at some Michigan data and a couple Michigan examples here. So Michigan currently, we are, like Alan said, working through implementing that statewide housing plan that was developed in 2022. And then just last month, I think we had a new statewide housing needs assessment that was released that really helps set that stage on a statewide level of what's going on with our housing. And so that statewide housing plan, it was the first one that our state had done. MISHDA really went all in on engaging with folks around the state to get this out, and it came out in 2022. And then in 2023, you may have been involved in that process of standing up regional housing partnerships, and those regions are outlined here on this map with the various letters. But they stood up these regional partnerships in Michigan, recognizing that we're not going to be able to tackle this problem with one strategy for the whole state. It really needs to be focused on those locally relevant solutions. So these regional housing partnerships are now working through their own action plans to implement work towards the goals from our statewide plan. So if you haven't seen the statewide plan, this is just a brief overview slide that goes over what the language of the plan is this. It has 8 priorities. Those are high-level areas that the state is focusing on. Moves down into 37 different goals and a total of 134 strategies contained under those goals. Your regional housing partnerships are selecting a few strategies and working through them with those coalitions. Now, in addition to setting out that sort of statewide vision through a plan, we also need data to know where we are. So on the slide, you can see the cover for this recently released needs assessment. And it is a partnership between MISHDA and U of M that released this, and it has a lot of those data and additional details about the state of housing here in the Mitten. And it really focuses in on the 4 areas of our housing inventory, our housing demand, the affordability, and then housing instability and homelessness. And as the quote on the slide illustrates, this report talks about the urgency for a comprehensive approach to address this complex problem, to ensure that all our residents have that safe, affordable, and stable housing options. So going through each of those bucket areas, our needs assessment looks like, just trying to give you a quick snapshot in case you haven't had a chance to read it. On our housing inventory, as of 2022, we had 4.6 million housing units for our total population of about 10 million here in Michigan. Majority of those are single family units. The majority are also owner occupied. And like we've seen in previous needs assessment, a lot of our stock is getting pretty old, being built before 1980. And also recognizing, here's a quote from the needs assessment, that there are significant racial disparities present in both renter and owner markets, though they're especially stark among owners. And we can see that racial home ownership gap that Alan was talking about as sort of that existing legacy of prior racist policies, in the fact that we have these disparities and they're getting worse. Black homeownership dropped 8% between 2000 and 2019. So we had these, as Mishta says, long-standing disparities in housing that compromised individuals and family access to housing and that important generational wealth building. So the graphic on the right side is from the 2024 needs assessment and just looks at some of those homeownership and rentership rates across racial ethnic categories. Moving on to the housing demand, remember economics, our supply, our inventory, and then our demand. The needs assessment identified 3 key indicators to understand our housing demand in the state. The first is our population, which it is slowly increasing. We had a couple rough years there, but it's slowly trending upward. And this is largely due to in-migration into the state, not necessarily increasing births. They also look at the number of households. The number of households in the state is increasing as well, especially in the 24 to 34-year-old age bracket. And the important thing here is remembering that households are the ones that consume housing, right? Our state population of 10 million is interesting, but we need to look at households if we're comparing to housing stock. So really using that as one of your key variables here. And then also looking at the income of those households to help understand the dynamics of the demand. And across the state, incomes have not been rising to match the fastly rising cost of housing we see, especially when we start looking specifically at that renter market. And what does that show up like? It shows up in the affordability section that the needs assessment took on. And here we have 2 graphics that would make my grad school stats professor very upset, because heads up, the scales are different on the left. So keep that in mind as we're reading this. But on the left graphic, we have our housing cost burden for renters in Michigan. These are those renters who are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. And you can see 50% of our renters hit that cost burden, with a full 25% being severely overburdened. That's getting up to that 50% of your income is going towards housing costs. Now shifting to the right, we're looking at homeowners and that same variable of cost burden, looking at spending more than 30% of your income on housing. And here we can see that for even among homeowners, we have 35% almost with those with a mortgage facing this cost burden, meaning the state, housing is getting unaffordable. And then the last area, thinking about that unaffordability and where that might lead for some of our neighbors, is housing instability or even homelessness, as we see incomes not keep pace with that price of housing. We see that evictions and rates of people experiencing homelessness are increasing around the state. And the same thing for tax foreclosures. Of course, we're still nowhere near those incredibly high peaks we saw in the mid-2010s as we were going through the foreclosure crisis, but there is this lack of affordable housing, and the gap between the incomes and housing costs lead to this instability and reinforces the inequities we see across our systems. So this, of course, is all great data from the statewide level. I'm a sociologist by training, and one of the things they really drill into us is make sure you've got your geography right for the questions you're asking. So if you want to know about what the state's like overall, the statewide report is a great place to go, but you also might need to look at more local data as you make these local decisions. And for that, want to lift up some other work that came out of our statewide housing plan, and that's MISHDA's Michigan Housing Data Portal. This came out, I think, just a couple months ago. I'm losing track of time, but it's an online interactive portal where you can go and find key housing data easily for your community and look at housing, demographic, economic variables at several geographic levels. It goes from state to the county and then down to those statistical areas that the census uses. So it might not track perfectly with your municipal boundaries, but it at least gets some more data that you can work with. And then also, you might want to see what's going on locally. On this slide, we have an image from Berrien County. They have a strategic leadership council in their county that came together and realized housing is an issue in Berrien. We need better data. So they built an interactive map, a story map of housing in Berrien County, and really gets to that hyper-local county and sub-county data to tell the story in Berrien County and also lift up potential tools that communities could use. So maybe your county is doing something similar, or maybe they've gotten recent funding to do a target market analysis, like I know some counties have. But again, getting that local data is really going to be the key first step as you start to figure out, okay, these trends that we're hearing about at the national and state level, what do they look like for us? So moving on to zoning as a tool for exclusion. This is something that Alan covered really well in that first webinar. And just a reminder that, modern zoning was designed to be exclusive. It was designed to separate those uses, create these sort of pockets of use types throughout communities, and it spread through those standard enabling acts that were put out by the federal government and really took off across our country as communities in the early 1900s started adopting these. Now, of course, you separate out uses, you're gonna get predictable patterns. So if you're separating out those single family zones like Alan was talking about, you're going to get a predictable built pattern of development that has all of your single family zones in one area. And doing that, keeping those detached large lot single family homes in one area, creates exclusive areas in communities. And these exclusive areas may have the impact of regulating where folks can live based on how much income you have. So this history that's outlined in the color of law and just action are really, we're seeing those impacts yet to this day. Because while zoning has its history in that public health, making sure we're separating out those industrial uses from where people are living and finding ways to mitigate other problems that were caused by urbanization, zoning also has a real history in racial and class bias segregation. Again, quoting from that Ambler Realty versus Village of Euclid that deemed zoning was constitutional, that important court case. It also talked about how, as that was working its way through the courts, that the zoning was a tool to classify the population and segregate them according to their income or their situation in life. Now take a moment. Think about your residential districts. Specifically, if you have those ones that are single family or have the large minimum lot size or house sizes, where are those areas where maybe there are those exclusive pockets that zoning has created that limits the choice for folks in your community? Now, this is a lot of content that has been covered in other areas, but I'll be honest, I spent a lot of time making this slide, so I use it as much as I can. It's just another reminder of sort of the timeline of this history of segregation and exclusionary zoning, going through all those key court cases and the Fair Housing Act in '68, ending there with our 2022 law here in Michigan about the discharge of those restricted covenants. But again, our housing situation, this history of policies, they have a long history. We're not going to solve these problems overnight, but we can begin to correct for some of those past decisions. So as we think about how we can do better into the future, the American Planning Association, APA, is a great source for resources for folks doing land use work. And some of the resources that they have include these policy guides that get the smart planners from all across the country together to come up with what are the policies for X topic. And they have a policy guide all about planning for equity. And this quote from the APA's equity policy or equity planning policy guide really sums up nicely why that history is important to keep in mind, because though such openly discriminatory practices are legal today, limitations on multifamily dwellings, affordable homes, group homes for those with disabilities, and similar housing opportunities for underserved people, including the formerly incarcerated, continue to perpetuate exclusionary practices. The legacy of these policies still contributes to a slippery slope that makes it difficult to secure a foothold in the economic mainstream. And if my slide would have played nicely, that would be a great pop-up showing, again, that racial home ownership gap here in Michigan that illustrates the lasting impact that we're seeing. So now we're going to start to turn to more specifics, going through some of those policies from the Planning for Equity Policy Guide and some examples from here in Michigan about what those look like on the ground. Now, I mentioned I do land use education as part of my role here at Extension, so my friends at the Citizen Planner team would be really upset with me if I didn't take a moment to remind you, here in Michigan, your zoning needs to be based on a plan. So as we're talking about these tools or options, remember, it's all going to start with that planning to build that rationale, set the vision for the community, and then move into changing those actual ordinances. But again, you have that plan that really provides that vision and the support for the policies you may implement. And of course, this is a local decision. This is why we have to plan. Don't take what I'm about to say as MSU Extension saying, this is the policy you have to do. These are your tools. This is for you to consider and then use your local expertise to figure out which one is most appropriate and where. And of course, planning and zoning are just pieces of our broader housing puzzle here. There are a lot of other aspects that need to work together. That partnership piece is so key here. But, zoning is great, but we also need to be thinking through what are those supportive housing services, counseling? What about home buyer education? Or maybe thinking about some of the administrative things like we'll talk about here in a little bit of just getting permit reviews through smoother. So again, it's all pieces of the puzzle. And one of the first housing policies that APA brings out in that Planning for Equity Guide is to promote diverse housing stock. And here they're meaning diverse in terms of both new builds as well as preservation of what's already there. Also, diversity in the variety of housing types. This slide has a graphic from Dan Perolik's design firm and Missing Middle Housing, the concept he developed that talks about some of those housing types that have fallen out of popularity since World War II, like the courtyard apartments or townhomes or duplexes, quadplexes. Additionally, communities, in order to promote that equity, can think about providing diversity in both tenure and price throughout their community. Are you able to rent or buy in all the areas of your community? Is there that choice for residents? If not, is that the outcome we want? Also, thinking about just providing more choice in zoning districts. That single family zoning district has one choice of housing type for folks who want to live there. Would we be able to open that up and expand the choice and allow people more freedom to do things on their property in those districts? The second policy that they raise up is to think about reforming your development regulations and really doing it with an eye towards promoting fair housing. And here, thinking about where are the opportunities for those protected classes in your community? Like Alan was talking, are they limited to particular areas? Are all the options for your senior housing in one small area? Are all of the subsidized housing in just one small area? Are we continuing to segregate? That's something to consider as you think about planning for more equity. Also, this is a conversation I'm seeing pop up in communities around Michigan, thinking about source of income discrimination, protecting renters from whether it's vouchers or other types of income that, hey, it doesn't matter, it's all going to be treated the same, and we're going to put in policies to make sure that happens. Also, preserving the existing affordable housing stock. This could be done through things like incentives, particular financing strategies, partnerships, City of Detroit is taking a real lead with this idea of preserving their missing middle housing. So they've got some great programs they've rolled out using American Rescue Plan Act dollars and other funds to really preserve those important housing types. And then thinking about removing those regulatory barriers in zoning that might impact the creation of that diverse housing stock. Now, I get it. You're probably thinking, Tyler, remove regulatory barriers. That's very vague, very broad. What does it mean? So I pulled an example here from the city of Grand Haven, who has been really working on their affordable housing for quite some time, since 2018, actually. And what they did is they established a task force to take on the issue of affordable housing. It provides a great illustration of what removing some of these regulatory barriers may look like. So on the slide now are the 3 goals that the housing task force had. Everybody who works in Grand Haven should be able to live there. That variety of housing options we were just talking about. And those who live in Grand Haven should be able to remain in Grand Haven as they age. So what that group did then is they went through their zoning ordinance and identified specific things that they could do to make this happen. I recognize some financial tools, maybe setting up a affordable housing community fund. They wanted to do a zoning ordinance rewrite, but the key one is that last one, the quarterly and annual progress reports, because that's really where I think they started to see some momentum here, because they were continuing to revisit this. And this task force did the work. They identified the specific zoning barriers, specific language in their community that was preventing their affordable housing goals. So they had this list of barriers and said that specific amendments to the zoning ordinance would reorient the previously mentioned challenges and make them great opportunities to incentivize private housing investments. And then through those annual reports, we're able to see how Grand Haven has been doing. In the last one, I looked at a 2021 annual report, 3 years after the task force had got started. The green checks mean that they made progress on those particular barriers. 2+ family units are now allowed in many districts. You're seeing more ADUs. Of course, a lot of this was with some back and forth, like any regulatory process is going to be. We see, okay, well, maybe we'll try this, and it wasn't working. So there's going to be those growing pains as you try on new ordinances, but they were here taking that concentrated look at, okay, what are our barriers and what can we do to change that? Similarly, we can think about that administrative process. What does it look like for a proposal to go from that first idea to being ready for somebody to move in? Often we see these bureaucratic or administrative steps cited as barriers by developers. They add time. Time adds cost. So around the country, we're seeing states like Rhode Island and Massachusetts either setting strict deadlines for approving projects or incentivizing some best practices in streamlining. Michigan took a similar approach to the sort of incentivizing through our redevelopment readies community. They have some great resources on thinking through streamlining your development review process there that gets to that same issue. And then, like Alan was saying, in Oregon now with inserting affirmatively furthering fair housing into master plans, another policy suggestion is to actually prepare master plan housing elements. This is one of those weird out there ideas, but if you set something as a goal and include it as part of your vision, it's more likely to get done. So we've seen states implementing those sort of housing requirements into master plans, and states found the most success when it was paired with some sort of regional support, like what you're seeing with our regional housing partnerships. And including those goals was actually associated with a decrease in the percentage of cost burden residents. Now, of course, we can't prove causation here, but it's a pretty, you plan for it and then it happens. So we're seeing that it's important to get these elements into your master plan. And the last key policy recommendation for housing for equity is to increase the supply of housing. And this is just about adding more units to your community through that combination of new production, preservation, renovations. The idea is here keeping those specific goals around affordability, diversity of housing stock, tenure type, design, combating displacement, fair housing, all keeping that in mind as you set these goals and work on increasing those goals or increasing your housing stock. Now, like I said earlier, this is going to look different for each community. What is going to work for downtown Detroit is not going to work for my rural Volenia Township. But whatever you choose should be based on good planning, solid data, and that community involvement that can help overcome some of those NIMBYism concerns that we're talking about at the start of this presentation. But really thinking through what are the tools in our toolbox and how can we use them to reach our goals. Now, this is just a little bit of what you can do around zoning and zoning reform for housing. MSU Extension has a suite of programs that we're able to deliver around these implementation techniques around planning for homes that goes into a lot more detail on some of these other zoning implementation techniques that can really increase that housing choice and expand choice for residents in your community. Also help with affordability by creating more variety and allowing some more turnover in your housing market. But even this is just a partial list of what can be done. Now, I like to tell my folks in programs that my love language is hyperlinks. So oftentimes I am sending emails with way too many links to resources. And even in this short presentation, want to make sure you had some additional things to further your learning here. If you want to start diving into some more of these tools, the best one that I could probably recommend is from our friends at our Michigan chapter of the American Planning Association, MAP, the Michigan Association of Planning, who around the same time that statewide housing plan was coming out, released their zoning reform toolkit for housing choice and supply. And this has 15 reforms for communities to consider, lots of great Michigan examples and images of what that looks like. Like with that other list, here's their 15 that they include just to show you. And thank you, Bree, for dropping that into the chat for me. But again, another great resource to work with and start having these community conversations around housing. And of course, MSU Extension is here to be a resource for you. So if you're interested in those housing programs, other education on planning and zoning, we have a team of highly knowledgeable folks around the state who are more than willing to talk about this, come in, present to your community, reach out with your questions. It's what Extension is here for. So when you get the slides as well, they'll have, of course, I come from university, so you got to include all your references, but lots of great additional information here if you really want to do that deep dive onto where I came up with some of this information or additional resources your community could use as you go about your housing planning work. But with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Alan and opening up for some Q&A here with our last little bit of time. What have we got?
Thank you so much, Tyler and Alan. I just want to say that first and foremost, really pleasure having you join us today. We currently do not have any questions in the chat. However, folks, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I do have just some more like open and some bigger questions that I know you guys covered a lot today. And I talked about this with Alan. This is one of the questions I asked him in our first session, but I wasn't able to really ask you, Tyler. What would you say is our toughest barrier with trying to implement equitable housing in Michigan from your perspective?
One of the biggest barriers I see as I'm working with communities is really that local capacity piece. Oftentimes when we're talking with a small township or a village where there are all in maybe 2-3 full-time employees, when you add them together, then yeah, getting into some of these deeper issues can really be a challenge when you've got day-to-day bills that need to get paid and things that need to get done. There's an election coming up. We have to plan for that. So I think finding ways to support communities as they start to have these housing discussions, like we're seeing the state do with some of their grant opportunities around planning and zoning reform, to really bring in some of that expertise and additional capacity to help local units have these hard conversations and get to the sort of community outcomes that they want. So that's probably the biggest challenge, and it shows up in a lot of different areas. You'll see, zoning ordinances that haven't been updated for a while, that are, when that capacity finally comes in whatever form, we're able to start looking at that and see, okay, what's changed since 1980 that we might want to do differently now. And so, yeah, that would probably be top of mind for me.
I think that's a great point, Tyler. We hear a lot of the same, particularly when we're, from the advocacy side, we don't necessarily see that, but we definitely hear that from our jurisdictional partners, right? Yeah, it's like, this is all fine and good. We're trying to get there, but we're literally a staff of an entire city staff of 2 people. The requirements we're implementing in Oregon are for cities above 10,000 people. And, you think about a city like that, that's a very small city, really. And so they're saying, same thing, they're asking the legislature, we've got some grant money that came to our Department of Land Conservation and Development. But the other thing we've looked at, there was just a bill that passed in the legislature this last session that also requires the department to build model codes, right? So we could build some off-the-shelf model codes that small communities can pick up to say, yeah, this is how we want to move forward. We're going to just plop this into our code. The other is creating safe harbors. So we're looking at creating safe harbors in the work we're doing to say, okay, here again is a set of things that if you do these, then you meet the requirements of what we're asking you to do. That one is up for debate right now. We haven't quite. It's part of the conversation we're having in writing the new rules, but it's another way that we can help support those local jurisdictions. Again, what I find is there's a difference between these local jurisdictions that want to do the right thing and those that just don't have the capacity to do the right thing, and different from those who have the capacity, who have the resources to do it, and just don't want to do the right thing, right? So you got to figure out how you legislate for those kinds of different circumstances. And we really want to support our local partners that do want to do the right thing, that want to remove all these barriers, that want to create these kinds of communities, but just don't have the resources to get there.
Thanks so much. That's something I didn't even think about, the capacity of each place and their planning department is very far and few between, especially for some of those smaller local governments. We're fortunate, I feel, in the city of Grand Rapids to have a very, from what I understand, a plentiful planning department.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Another, I guess, it's probably a big question, I apologize, but actually we have a question in the chat. I actually will ask this question. So one of the concerns I have is that practices of segregation haven't been embraced by residents. We hear from homeowners that they don't want renters in their neighborhoods. We hear from minority neighborhoods fear of inviting racial diversity into their neighborhoods. This is more for us. Will a future session cover some of these neighbor concerns? Thank you so much for that question. Yes. So we were fortunate enough to receive an additional grant to do some more education on this topic. So our current series of fair housing and housing development is focused on those who are developing housing. And then our next series will focus more on that neighborhood and community organizing around developing housing, more focused on those impacted in the communities. So that will be a future series within this. And so please stay tuned for that and make sure you're on our email list to get those updates. Go ahead.
On that question though, Bree, one thing I can add, quick story time. I was recently in one of those very small villages here in Michigan as they're going through zoning reform. And this type of issue came up as they were thinking about, do we begin to add maybe some duplexes, some triplexes in some of the areas of our village? And this was a joint meeting between their planning commission and the village board, but they're talking about it, and they came up with exactly this, sort of the first half of this question of, being concerned about what renters are going to mean for the neighborhood, because the people sitting up there in those elected and appointed positions had the worst idea of what a rental unit could be in their mind as we're talking about it. They all went to the ones in the neighboring township that are, a box with vinyl siding, as they said, and that's it. And so there was a great conversation that then was happening between the planner and those officials about, okay, so what's the issue we're really trying to solve for here? Are we concerned about noise from these neighbors? Well, that's why we have a noise ordinance and we can enforce on that. Are we concerned about blight? Well, we have a blight ordinance too, and we can enforce on that. So thinking about all of those tools in your local unit's toolbox when you get those neighbor concerns can really help sort of make sure we're choosing the appropriate tool and also, using them, making sure we're enforcing in an equitable way in those code enforcements of, making sure we're treating everybody fairly, but we can use these various tools to make sure we get over some concerns. And I think a similar approach for the second half of that question of, okay, I'm going to believe the best in people and, assume that there's not a fear of racial diversity, but what's the real issue here then? What is the concern and what tools do we have to mitigate for that in that particular neighborhood?
Yeah, and I think from a fair housing perspective, I think it's really interesting too. One of the foundational fair housing court cases is Traficante, and part of that decision is rooted in the sense that that white community members were part of that case, saying, we were denied the opportunity to live in racially integrated communities, and that harmed us also, right? It wasn't just because racially and ethnic minorities were excluded. It's because we didn't have the opportunity to live in integrated communities. So we know that there is a value to that. And that speaks to that first part. I think because communities are so segregated, we don't understand that there might be a value there, that that there's a sort of the fear of the unknown. And so that's part of what we have to get over. I think the second part of the question you said, Tyler, is also that communities of color are afraid of integrating their communities because what we've seen is displacement. Right. And so again, we're solving for the wrong problem. The problem isn't we don't want integrated communities, but in a community of color, any community that has been integrated has meant displacement. Right. So we can try to solve for that problem differently. Could we take a community of color that that we invest in that doesn't displace communities? Right. And does it have to be integrated? It's really interesting to think about the work of fair housing, whether or not it means what we want is communities that are 50% white and 50% communities of color, or should we have communities that have come together racially or ethnically, maybe out of safety? Do we need to break up those communities? It's a real question about, what we want our communities to look like and for what reasons, frankly, right? And that really goes back to engaging those communities and understanding what the concerns and the desires and opportunities are.
That's great. We did have another question come in, so I think we are almost. So I'll take this last question, and then we might wrap it up unless we have a really quick one. But somebody asked in the chat, do you see any fair housing concerns if a city changed all its zoning to form-based code for their type of zoning? They're in their community in West Michigan. They're currently thinking about doing this. Would people have a lot more choices with the types of buildings they build?
My sense is that most of Michigan has done that, right? Under some of the work that's been done. So what I would answer is that this is one of those policies that on its face is neutral, right? It's not about who lives in the housing, it's what the type of housing is. If it had the effect of excluding certain types of people, it might. But I don't think that that form-based housing would do that. The one concern, and I don't know enough about that, what all the mechanisms would be. If it decreased housing costs, that would be a positive, and my sense is it probably does. So it would decrease exclusion economically. So that's my take on anything, Tyler, that you can think about. I know you all been involved in form-based housing for a long time in Michigan.
Yeah, and here there is a broad spectrum of things that could be considered a form-based code, and lots of communities are, inserting form-based elements. Okay. So yeah, I think any sort of a blanket statement about form-based zoning overall, it's going to really depend on how it's implemented as to what that form-based is looking like. Are we talking the most architectural standards you've seen? Everything needs to look exactly the same, that kind of form-based code? That's different than we're just regulating building envelope to get a house scale building. So I think it's going to depend on what it looks like. What I would say is, given where that community is in the process, thinking about how we're planning equitably in the front end and really starting with that solid foundation to make sure whatever the actual regulations are developed are having that broad community support and reaching out to those who maybe weren't as involved in earlier decisions that led to some of the outcomes that are trying to be corrected for now.
Yeah, and I think the hard part with that blanket statement, right, is that one person's incentive or one person's, good intentions moving forward is another person's loophole, right? If you have bad intentions, if you open that, it potentially becomes a loophole that somebody with bad intentions can use to exclude. We see that in lots of different instances.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate you joining us. And this was really helpful as we begin to think about how to apply how to apply this and the history that we reviewed in the last session. And just going forward, this is a really great segue to our next session, which will be on July 18th at 1 p.m. It will be our third session, and Alan will be joined by Kristen Turkelson, who is the planning director for the city of Grand Rapids. This session will highlight more again of how fair housing can be put into practice from the perspective of those in the government at planning, government employees in the planning and zoning departments. So please join us on July 18th for that session. And again, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Tyler, for being here today. And the email following this will include the recording to this and the resources. I will make sure to include some of the links from Tyler's presentation as well. And lastly, don't forget to complete the evaluation. So thank you all, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye.